Well, welcome everyone. We are just going to give the rest of our attendees a minute to join, and then we will get started shortly. So sit tight, and we'll be getting started in just a minute. Well, it looks like we have some more attendees rolling in, but we will go ahead and get started. My name is Derek Torbeck. I will be your host today, Senior Manager here at Office Practicum. And we have a wonderful webinar for you today, educational webinar on RCM best practices, understanding KPIs, benchmarks, and performance improvement. And just a few housekeeping items of note. We will definitely have some time for some Q&A towards the end of the presentation. So there is a questions box in your go-to instance. Please feel free to ask any questions at all that come to mind, and we will be addressing those. We do have some resources that I'll be going over towards the end of the presentation. You don't want to miss that, that are available to you, which includes some case studies and a PDF overview. And also, we are giving away two $50 Amazon gift cards. So you have to stay till the end because we will be having a survey once the webinar ends. And in order to have a chance to participate in this giveaway, you do need to complete our wonderful survey that has some really good questions on it for us to know. So really looking forward to that. And so what will we be going over today on our webinar? Well, we're going to review pediatric-specific KPIs you should be monitoring, including volume metrics, efficiency metrics, and time to pay metrics. We're going to identify areas of improvement, efficiency, and growth. And we're going to show you how benchmarking KPIs can provide insight as to how your practice is performing. Then put an action plan in place for improved financial outcomes. And as you can see on screen, we have a couple of wonderful speakers today that will be leading our webinar, starting with Matthew Douglas. Matthew is our operations business analyst, and his bio is on screen. But certainly, Matthew, I'm sure the attendees want to hear from you if you have a few words that you'd like to say.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming to our presentation. I'm Matthew, and I've been the data analyst for the OPRCM team for a little over 4 years now. And really, the most important thing to know about me is that I've been obsessed with data and numbers since I was a kid. I've been running stats on card games, board games, sports since I can really remember. And today, I just apply that enthusiasm for pediatrics.
Wonderful, Matthew. And then, of course, not to be outdone, our very own Christina Oliva, RCM CSS team lead. Her bio is also on screen, and I'm sure she would like to say a few words as well to address our attendees.
Yes, thank you, Derek. Hi, everybody. My name is Christina Oliva, and as Derek mentioned, I am one of the OP RCM CSS team leads. And I have been with OP for about 2 years, but my experience is about 20 years long in multiple specialties. And over the course of my career, I found myself digging into payer policies and trying to find the reasons for those denials that nobody can figure out. So now I'm considered somewhat of a payer specialist and just help everybody figure things out. And I'm excited to share this information with you all today.
Lovely. Well, let's get started. Thank you, Matthew and Christina. I will let you take it away. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Derek. So starting off with KPIs, since they're going to be the primary focus of our presentation today, KPI stands for Key Performance Indicators. And in order to understand that, you can sort of break down the acronym, starting with each word backwards. So starting with I, indicator, that's referring to some kind of measurement. So that can be dollars, days, a ratio of one number versus another. And then P, performance, is what we're measuring. So that could be dollars of revenue, days in, accounts receivable. With that being said, most anything can be a PI. Number of hot dogs eaten on a Sunday is technically a performance indicator, but that's why we really ought to underline the K in KPI, because key performance indicators are those specific measurements that diagnose the health of your operation and can be used to help align your performance with the goals of your organization. Now, KPIs can still be quite broad, so we tend to break them down into two different types. Strategic KPIs, which are high-level organizational performance summaries, and operational KPIs, which are performance measurements at very specific tasks. For pediatrics, we'll be looking at KPIs in three groups. These aren't hard and fast categories, but they're helpful for organizing related measurements. And those categories are volume metrics, time to pay metrics, and efficiency metrics. Now we'll be going over a number of KPIs today that we've identified as helpful to track for general pediatrics performance, but you can feel free to turn anything that you can measure and that you think is important to the health of your business into your own usable KPI. Just keep in mind that the best KPIs are clear, concise, communicative, and tell some story about your practice's operations. So starting on the next slide, we'll dig into that first group of metrics, the volume metrics. So these are strategic, those high-level KPIs that are focused on reimbursements and the relationship of those reimbursements to your outstanding or accounts receivable balances. So these metrics are important because they describe the relationship between your claims billed and your ability to close those claims, which is a general good indicator of your overall revenue cycle performance at that strategic level.
That's right, Matthew. And when approaching your volume metrics, there are a few questions you should be asking yourself to make sure that you're approaching it with the right mindset. Now, is my total AR too high? Is my total AR increasing? Now, reimbursement is expected within 30 days of clean claim submission. So if you answered yes to any of those questions, then chances are further investigation is required because there's some sort of issue that you may be missing. Now, as far as the age of your AR balances, if you notice that your AR balances over 90 days are growing, chances are that there's not being reviewed with enough frequency. It's best practice to work every AR claim at least 30 to 60 days. Doing so will keep your AR from aging and prevent timely filing denials that could have been missed. And it also helps you find any kind of issue that may be widespread that you weren't aware of. You pick up on those things when you review your AR, so be sure to do that. Now in our next slide, Matthew's going to go over the details about a few volume metrics that can help manage your AR.
Thanks, Christina. So some specific volume metrics. We'll start with days in AR. This is the ratio of your open claim balances to charges as represented as an average number of days to close balances. What that means is that your days in AR is representing the relationship between the existing open balances you have and the new balances that you're creating through billed charges. So when days in AR goes up, that means your total AR balance is increasing relative to the charge amounts that you're putting out, which can be indicative of certain process issues in your practice. Days in AR is a metric that you'll want to keep as low as possible, just like our next metric, your AR over 90%. AR over 90% is simply the percent of your open balances that are older than 90 days. So the dollar amounts of open balances older than 90 days from date of service divided by the total dollar amount of your outstanding balances. This metric is important because it quickly summarizes the age of your outstanding balances, which is critical because the older your balances are, the more at risk they are of not being paid. Then finally, we have our net collection rate, which is the dollar amount of balances closed versus the dollar amount of balances opened in a specific time period. net collection rate is sort of like a how much of my AR did I close. Month to month, we'd love for that number to be 100%, but we understand that you don't get paid on your claims immediately, if only. So we try to factor that delay in and examine net collection rate in relationship to our balances over time. If our net collection rate is under 100%, that means our total open balances is going up. If our net collection rate is greater than 100%, that means our total open balances is going down. So over time, we'd like the trend of our net collection rate to be between 98 and 100% to make sure that we're working and closing balances overall quite well, but month to month, we'll definitely see some fluctuations. Now, it should be becoming clear that there's a pipeline between net collection rate, days in AR, and AR over 90. They're very closely related metrics, and they sort of domino into one another, kind of like the events of a novel. And between Christina and I, Christina's far more the storyteller here, so I'll let her talk to the relationships between these volume metrics.
Thank you, Matthew. I do love a good novel. But, Matthew's right, folks. The story of volumetrics can be told by paying attention to your KPIs, and it all starts with your NCR. Now, once a low NCR has been identified, within the next month or two, you're going to notice that your days in AR is increasing. If the root cause of the issue of your days in AR increasing has not been identified, inevitably your 90 plus or your 90 plus days in AR will also increase. And this is where you're starting to face the issue of possibly losing money due to timely filing. And nobody wants their story told that way. Thankfully, KPI storytelling isn't something that our OP RCM customers have to worry about, as we have a highly skilled RCM and data analysis team that monitors these KPIs, allowing our RCM clients to focus on providing the best possible care to their patients. Now, Matthew knows about this firsthand, as he is the leader of our data analysis team, and he helps our RCM clients read their KPI stories. Is that correct, Matthew?
That's exactly right, Christina. So for RCM, I have to monitor the performance of our near 100 practices month to month, and I lean on these volume metrics to get that sort of high level understanding of that performance, and especially that performance over time. Strategic KPIs are big picture, which means that you can't look at just one metric at one given point in time and expect to get the whole story. That's like trying to summarize a novel with one page. You're not going to get the complete, you're not getting the complete story. And you can kind of see that by looking at the client data example here on the slide. So as an example, if you're looking at month 6 and specifically just your net collection rate in month 6, your net collection rate at 97%, which isn't exactly where we'd want it to be in aggregate, but on any given month, that's perfectly acceptable. And we might think that our operation is doing quite well, but then we're ignoring the fact that we have this chunk of open balances that are quite old, that each and every day we are putting at risk of not being collectible anymore. On the opposite end, at month 1, if we were only looking at days in AR, we might think that we're well within a healthy benchmark for our total outstanding balances, while completely being unaware of that blaring signal alarm that our net collection rate is trying to inform us about, that there are a ton of balances not going closed, and that we need to work especially hard in the following months to follow up on the claims that we just billed so that that AR doesn't continue to age and become more and more at risk. Now, with all that being said, these are, again, just strategic KPIs. They're really good at identifying how our operation is doing at a high level, but in order to identify points of error and improvement, we need those operational KPIs that really drill down into our performance at specific tasks. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about on the next slide. So, time to pay metrics. These are operational KPIs that are focused on how long claims sit at each stage of the billing cycle. These are immediately different than strategic KPIs because they're measuring specific processes and how your practice performs at each of those processes at that operational level.
That's right, Matthew. And with the time to pay metrics, because they are operational, you'll want to ask yourself a different set of questions when approaching this data. Now, how long are encounters taking to get signed and converted once the patient has been seen? And once the claim has been converted, how long is it taking to release that claim to the payer? Now, ideally, best practice states that within 72 hours of a patient being seen, the claim should be signed and ready to bill. And once the claim is ready to bill, it's best practice to get it out the door and to the payer within 48 hours. Now, when it comes to payments and EOBs received from the payers, some have money and some don't. Getting those posted into the system in a timely manner is essential to balancing your books. Now, if you receive EOBs or ERAs from a payer that don't have a payment attached, it's best practice to get those posted right away. But if there is a payment attached, you'll want to make sure that the payment has cleared the bank within 48 hours and get it posted right away so that you can balance things. In our next slide, Matthew's going to go over time to pay metrics a little more in detail and how you can use them.
All right, so some specific time to pay metrics. We'll start at the highest level with close rate. Close rate is the measure of the percentage of payments received for charges billed within a specific time frame. So as a specific example, let's say we billed a certain amount of charges in January of this year. And then by the end of March, we've posted total payments to 70% of those charges. That means our 3-month close rate on January is 70%, January, February, March, 3 months. And then we might continue to track that to say our 4-month close rate at the end of April might be 85%, and so on and so forth, until that close rate becomes 100% and all of our charges are closed. Then, in a bit more detail, we can isolate the specific stages that claims are sitting in with billing turnaround time and posting turnaround time. These two metrics measure the average number of days it takes to bill a claim and post a transaction to a claim respectively. These two metrics are averages, which means you're going to be taking the number of days that each of your claims is waiting to be billed from date of service or to have a transaction posted to it from the date that you receive the EOB, and average them all together for a month or 3 months, say. On the next slide, we'll look at how you can use some of these metrics more specifically. So starting at the top, we have pay cycle. And pay cycle is sort of a sneaky strategic KPI that rolls up under time to pay metrics, because it's summarizing your billing turnaround time, your posting turnaround time, and your time to pay all in one. Your time to pay being how long your claims are sending out with payers or a clearinghouse before it comes back to you to post a transaction to. Pay cycle captures the lifetime of each of your claims. And so if we see that that metric is particularly high or not low, we know that we can then look at each of those individual stages that comprise the pay cycle in order to dig into where our performance is excelling or underperforming. As an example, if our pay cycle is, say, 90 days, that means it's taking an average of 90 days for us to receive payments for the things that we're working today. And ideally, we'd like that to be a lot sooner. So we'll dig into the billing turnaround time, time to pay, and posting turnaround time for our claims. If we see that billing turnaround time is something like 15 days, that means we know that we can probably look into our billing processes to try and get claims faster out the door after services are provided. Likewise, if our time to pay is something like 70 days, we might be seeing rejections and denials on our claims that are forcing us to resubmit them multiple times. And so we'll need to look at how claims are going out the door specifically to try and close down that time to pay to something a lot more smooth and efficient. Now, we can also use close rate to identify specific points in time in which our operation might be faltering. And the way that we do that is through a collection of close rates that is represented in a waterfall model. So if you're looking at the table as it's presented on the slide, charges for each month is being summarized column by column left to right. And then the payments being applied to those charges are being summarized in the rows top to bottom. So if we're looking at that first column for September 2021 charges, we can see that within 2 months, by the end of October, we've posted payments to 25% of those charges, which is not a lot. But by the end of the 3rd month, November, we posted 84%. That means that in those first 60 days, we're not getting as much work, as much payments in as we would like to for the claims that we billed in September. And that means likely the first part of our pay cycle, that billing turnaround time and time to pay, is probably where we might be seeing issues. Although again, we'll need to dig into each of the metrics individually in order to get the true sense of where claims are sitting. Now, similarly, you can look at, say, the 4th column on this waterfall model for December 2021's charges and see that there's a similar problem. In those first 2 months, our close rate is exceptionally low, and then we catch up in February and March. And so what this allows us to see is, well, for December 2021's charges specifically, we really dropped the ball in that first 60 days. And that might be because, say, billing staff were on vacation. Maybe we started billing for something and then got a bunch of denials for it because we were missing modifiers or something or another. But we can then isolate our performance in that specific period of time and drill into what we can do better in the months moving forward. Now, we've looked at these operational KPIs, but we still haven't touched on, in any of the metrics that we've talked about so far, dollar amounts and what you're actually being reimbursed in cash for the services that are being provided, which is exactly what we're going to get into in our next set of metrics. So, efficiency metrics. These are KPIs that are going to be focused on how much money you are being reimbursed per patient visit. These metrics are by far the most complex of the bunch we're talking about today, since they're the product of many, many details about your practice's revenue cycle. Therefore, in order to utilize them properly, you're going to need to drill down into the details in order to fully understand what these KPIs are communicating, such as at a payer by payer or even provider by provider level.
And just like the other metrics, these come with questions. So you want to ask yourself, how are you coding your sick visit? If you're coding them a little too low, you could be leaving money on the table. And if you're coding them too high, you run the risk of receiving record requests from payers or possibly just denials based on the coding, and that's not something you want to have to deal with. Now, our OP system does have an E&M tool to help you select, based on the services rendered that day, the most appropriate E&M for your needs. Now, when it comes to how much you're being reimbursed on your claims, as far as comparing to other practices, that's a process called benchmarking. And Matthew here is going to go over that just a little bit with you all. But what about your contracts? What about your fee schedules and your contracted amounts? Have you recently updated them? Have you contacted your insurances? Do you do that annually? That's something you really want to make sure you get a hold of, because we see far too often that providers don't do that and they're leaving money on the table when they in fact could be owed more based on possible contract increases that would be available to them had they reached out. So make sure you're doing your due diligence, folks. And last but not least, how much money are you writing off and for what reasons? Denial reasons can be tricky, and to know which ones you can and cannot fight can be a process. A little later in this presentation, I'm going to go over some denial reasons and how to read your EOB to give you more insight on that. But first, it looks like Derek is going to be joining us to share a polling question.
Christina, thank you so much, and Matthew too, thank you. And I certainly am. It's not an OP webinar without a wonderful polling question, right? So let's get into that. If we can get to the next slide. And here we are. So it's up to you, attendees. Are you currently tracking your practice's top denial reasons? It's a simple yes or no question, and we're going to give you about 25 to 30 seconds to answer, starting now. And a OP team, if we can start pulling up those results. in about 30 seconds. Wow. Well, Christina, it looks like we have an even split, 50-50 across the board here. Love to hear your comments about that.
Well, that's good and bad, folks. Half of you get it. You understand how important it is to follow your polling questions. And half of you, that's okay. All's not lost. That's why we have this webinar. And that's why we're going to go over how you can track them and how to keep an eye on it in the future. But first, we're going to get back to Matthew to talk about those efficiency metrics.
Yep, so just the next slide here. Awesome, thank you. So some specific efficiency metrics. But before I get into any of them specifically, I'd just like to start off at the top by saying, for all of these efficiency metrics, you're gonna have multiple different versions of them based on the different details that you're incorporating into them when you calculate them. So as a perfect example, pay per visit. This is the average reimbursement per visit across all visits. So your payments for a time period divided by your visits in that time period. With that being said, you can have a pay per visit, say, by payer. You could have a pay per visit by provider. You could split your pay per well visits from your pay per sick visits. There are a bunch of different versions of the pay per visit metric that are just dependent on the factors that you are incorporating into your data when you calculate that KPI. Similarly, coding levels are the breakdown of your sick and well visits by the different level that they're being coded at. So you calculate it by taking the number of level 1 or 2 or 3, so forth, sick visits divided by the total number of sick visits. And then for well visits, same thing, number of level X well visits divided by your total well visits. So like pay per visit, you're gonna have 10 different coding level metrics that you're going to be tracking month over month or year over year that you're going to be measuring against one another. And again, just that for these efficiency metrics, you have so many more of them because of the different ways that you're dividing up the data than you do some of our other ones. And then finally, denial reasons and dollars. So you're going to be looking here at your dollars denied by the category or reason for those denials. And then with that information, you can even calculate, say, a denial rate by taking the denials for that specific time period divided by the charges for that time period. And you can split that up by category too. So say you had $3,000 in timely filing denials and billed $100,000 of claims, your timely filing denial rate would be 3%. All right, to the next slide. So how can we apply efficiency metrics? Well, as I've said, these are influenced by a number of factors, meaning that we need to, in order to best use efficiency metrics, we need to know the details that we're accounting for as we review them. To that end, it's harder to say that there's a perfect, say, pay per visit for Aetna in your specific region that you should be expecting to see without knowing, again, all of those details that are going into it for your practice. So efficiency metrics are the KPIs that are going to be most dependent on clear and effective benchmarking to get the most use out of it. However, to get something a bit more actionable, we can still look at our denials information. So if you're looking at the table here at our different dollar amounts denied for the different denial reasons as listed, we can take a look at each of these denial reasons and see the points in our operation that could be improved in order to get that additional money in and additional money in faster than what we're currently seeing. However, even just seeing denial reasons by category might not be enough to get that actionable information that you can use to improve your operations. For example, that $43,000 that we're seeing in non-covered in this example, we'd probably want to see a breakup of that information payer by payer, since non-covered denials are typically going to be payer dependent.
That is true, but that can sometimes not be the case, Matthew, because when it comes to non-covered denials, you need to look at the RARC code that's shared on the claim to really understand what's going on. Some of them are actually based on national guidelines and they're not payer specific. In our next slide, we're going to go over what a CARC and a RARC is, two items that you find on EOBs that will help you understand them just a little bit better. Now, a CARC is a claim adjustment reason code. This is an adjustment code that you're always going to see aligned with every CPT billed on every claim. It's the primary reason for the adjustment on the claim, and it's valuable information that you can use with the metric tools that Matthew has shared. Now, as far as the RARC code, the remittance advice code, this is an additional information or supplemental code. Not every single EOB is going to have them, but you are going to have non-specific CARCs, the first one we discussed, that are going to need this remark code to deem them necessary. In our next slide, we're going to go over an EOB to show you how they're applied. Now here we have the top and bottom portion of an EOB. On the top left portion of the EOB, you'll see that there's CPT codes aligned with billed charges. In the next section, there's codes that you may or may not recognize aligned with adjustment amounts. And in our last box, we have the amount the providers were paid for the services rendered. Now, in the second box, the highlighted codes, those are CARC codes. Those are the codes that are going to tell you what's going on with your claim. As you can see, any of them that say CO45 have both an adjustment and a payment in the payment category. CO45 is a contractual adjustment. This adjustment means that you have been paid the most allowed per your contract with that payer, and the amount they're adjusting off is in excess and nothing else is owed. This code is usually going to come with the payment, so we don't normally pay too much attention to it because we were paid as expected. It's the other ones you have to pay a little bit more attention to. As you can see, there's CO234 and CO16 on several of the other codes, and they do not have a payment in the payment category. CO234 means that this procedure is not paid separately. So another code on this claim has bundled in with CO234 with that CPT code, and CO234 is letting you know that it's not reimbursable. But then you have 16. Now 16 doesn't really give you much information. It just tells you that it's lacking information. So this is a situation where we're going to need more help from that RARC code that I mentioned earlier. As you can see in the top of the screen, there's codes highlighted in green. Those are the remark codes or the RARC codes. And at the bottom of the EOB, you'll see that the RARC code is also defined right under those CARCs. M119 is the one that we see is aligned with CO16 at the top of our EOB, and that indicates that they're missing or there's an incomplete or invalid national drug code. So whatever vaccine or drug product was billed is missing the NDC code. So you'll just want to make sure that you have the correct 542 format and that the full 11-digit NDC code is present. Now understand, this is an informational CARC, so you would never have known what was actually wrong with the claim had you not looked at the RARC. The RARCs are informational and not always present, but when they are, they'll give you the information needed. In general, you're going to see some non-specific CARC codes that will need that second RARC code to define them. In our next slide, we have a little bit more information. I made you a grid for you to follow. In the top left box, these are CARC codes that will require that secondary RARC code to define them. As a matter of fact, if you were to see any of these three, 1696 or A1 on your claims, their full definition indicates that use of a remark code or a RARC code is required to know further what to do. In every other box on this screen, these are situations, denial situations that do define what's wrong with the code based on the CARC, but if you look at the RARC, there may be additional information. Certain situations in the first category, like 197 pre-certification, it may say there that pre-certification is not required, but your RARC may say that the pre-certification was exceeded. So as a matter of fact, it's not that it was required and not present, it was required and exceeded. So certain details like that are available to you by looking at your EOBs. Looking at your EOBs, understanding them, and utilizing the metrics that Matthew has provided will give you a much clearer insight on what's going on with the financial health of your practice. Next slide, please.
All right. Thank you for all of that wonderful, very detailed information on denials, Christina. That was exceptionally helpful. For all of our other metrics that are in which you can't really get into the exact payer reasons for, we need to lean on benchmarking in order to make the most out of our ability to capture that information on our business's operations. So when it comes to benchmarking, there are two different methods with two different purposes. The first kind of benchmarking is internal benchmarking. And that's going to be where you set targets for your different KPIs based on a combination of best practice, experience, and other internal goals, like let's say a financial goal for your practice. This kind of benchmarking is best for setting unique standards based on your unique circumstances and is going to leverage a lot of your own knowledge about what your business is doing and is capable of. However, by that same token, internal benchmarking can introduce bias based on a lack of perspectives outside the organization when you're setting the standards that you're going to try and hold your operation to. The second kind of benchmarking is external benchmarking, which is where you're going to compare your business's performance against other similar practices. This kind of benchmarking is best for getting a measure of performance versus the industry and kind of inherently ropes in that outside perspective that we have to work towards to get into our internal benchmarks. However, external benchmarking requires a very careful consideration of all of the details and the metrics that you're comparing in order to be most effective. So that can be either guaranteeing that you're getting an apples to apples comparison, or otherwise just being aware of all of the different details that get a KPI to what it is for both your practice and the practice that you're comparing to. So on the next slide, we'll look at some best practices for internal benchmarking. First, and this goes for both kinds of benchmarking, internal and external, you want to set goals that are specific and attainable. So as an example, a days in AR of 5 may not be obtainable by your practice or most practices, but 20 could be achievable while being within best practice for your specific operation. Then for internal benchmarking, it's kind of best to start big, then work your way down. If you think about the relationship between strategic and operational KPIs, your operational KPIs are going to roll up into those summary strategic metrics. So think about how each of the different parts of your claims life cycle, the billing turnaround time, time to pay, and pay cycle all contribute onto that pay cycle overall. So if you set your strategic goals first, that'll help inform you as to what your operational KPIs need to be in order for you to reach that strategic target. Thirdly, consult external resources. The best way to minimize that bias is to talk to peers, consult resources, like professional resources around healthcare and pediatrics. See if you can tap into aggregate sources of data that exist for pediatric practices in order to get a sense of where healthy operations sit, especially for those strategic KPIs on average for practices. And then lastly, different payers should probably have different benchmarks. You can't necessarily expect every payer to operate exactly the same way. And you should account for that when setting your internal benchmarks. Now, on the next slide, Christina is going to go over and tell a story about how internal benchmarking can be used to improve your practice's performance.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Thank you for all that information on benchmarking. It's very helpful. Yeah, just like we learned earlier in our webinar, metrics tell a story. And in this story that we're telling now, it looks like our NCR is meeting its benchmark because it's green and because it's the same amount as the benchmark. But some of our other strategic KPIs are in the yellow, and that's concerning. While we may not be able to identify it just by looking at them, we can by breaking them down just a little bit further. So we always start with our NCR and we break it down by payer just to see how that's going. On the right side of the screen, you'll see when we break it down by payer that UHC has a fantastic NCR of 105%, probably what's driving that benchmark number so high in general. Aetna is almost meeting the benchmark at 97%, and Blue Cross seems to have an issue at the 92% mark. So since Blue Cross is well below the benchmark, we're going to dig a little bit into them first because that's most likely the main cause of our issue. Now, breaking down Blue Cross, we're going to go into the coding reason. We're going to go into the denial reason, starting with coding, non-covered, and eligibility. As you can see, not digging too much deeper, the issue here seems to be coding related. If we can address this issue as we find it, fix those claims, then start working on that yellow, the eligibility issues, and from there, those non-covered, you'll break down that Blue Cross issue and it will bring up the NCR. Once you've addressed all the issues with Blue Cross and Blue Shield, you're going to want to go to your next lowest NCR, which in this case would be Aetna. Do the same thing with whatever denial reasons you find with Aetna, and from there, you'll start seeing the changes in your strategic KPIs. Now, in our next slide, Derek is back for a poll question.
I am indeed back. That was wonderful. Thank you, Christina and Matthew. We do have our second and final polling question for the attendees, and that is, what do you feel is a healthy benchmark for your time to first revenue, meaning average days from claim creation to the first insurance payment? And here are your options. We have 14 days, 30 days, 60 days, or 100 days. We will give you 25 to 30 seconds to vote. And OP team, if we could start bringing those up, those results. Okay. Well, Matthew, it looks like 30 days is leading the way substantially at 60%, followed by 14 days at 32%. What do you think of these results?
Well, first, Derek, I'd like to congratulate our audience for setting an internal benchmark. But to provide some external perspective to the internal benchmark that was just set, I think it's really good that most people set a aggressive target around 30 or 14 days. For something like time to first revenue, you can generally achieve a 30 days as long as you're doing best practices around the board, and you can even get it tighter and closer to that 14 days, especially for certain payers, especially so. For those that benchmarked around 60 days, again, it's best practice for what you believe and understand is achievable for your specific operation. Although generally speaking, you might be able to achieve 30 days if you're able to tackle all of the parts of your operation and bring them up to the best that they can possibly be. Now, with all that, let's get into external benchmarking and some of the best practices that you can employ when doing so. So for external benchmarking, again, we're isolating comparable metrics between your practice and a similar practice. So if we're trying to get that apples to apples comparison to account for all of the details to make sure we're combining exactly like things, that means we're going to want to be looking at operational KPIs, some measurements that are focused in on something very specific. And we're going to be wanting to account for the very basic high-level features. So payers, regions. I've seen people go into reimbursements by payer, by region on a code-by-code basis, essentially comparing fee schedules. You don't always need to go into such detail to get something out of external comparisons, but just one example of how much detail you can really dive into when trying to achieve that apples-to-apples comparison. However, external benchmarking doesn't always have to be exactly one-to-one. You can do things like higher level comparisons of data as long as you are giving that information enough context. So for example, you might be able to compare your net collection rate to another practice's net collection rate, as long as you are accounting for the various reasons why your net collection rate looks the way it does in a given month, and the way the net collection rate of another practice looks the way that it does. It's being able to understand the details that factor into how your metrics arrived at what they are that will give you actionable items moving forward. So we can look on the next slide at some examples of how we can use external benchmarking. So in the first example here on the left, two practices are comparing their pay cycle for New York Medicaid. So we're already off to a good start because we're looking at the same state with the same payer. The metric isn't super dependent on region for the most part, which means we can then start looking at other factors to try and figure out why the pay cycle for practice B is higher than the pay cycle for practice A. So some of the factors that we could look into are, say, perhaps the ERAs versus paper remittances for practice B versus practice A for this payer. We also might look into the rejections and denials that practice B is seeing for this payer versus practice A. Maybe see if there are specific ways of coding that practice B is doing that practice A isn't or is doing. And use that to figure out points of improvement that practice B can employ to achieve similar performance to the practice that they're comparing to. In example 2, we're going to look at a metric that's a bit more specific, which is going to be Georgia UHC payers pay per claim. So again, same state, same payer, but in order to get the most out of something like this pay per visit, you're going to have to look at, for this efficiency metric, a ton of different details. So for example, what are practice A and practice B specialties? Are the providers that are billing for this insurance nurse practitioners or MDs? What % of claims are going out for nurse practitioners versus MDs for the two practices? What's the network participation and how are providers credentialed across these two practices for this payer? What time of year are you looking at? Are you making sure that you're comparing pay per visit for the exact same time frames to make sure that you're trying to account for seasonal differences that you might see in what's being billed at different points in the year? There's no real easy way to do external benchmarking. You need to be able to collect a bunch of information about your practice's performance and another practice's performance in order to get the most out of this. And that's why even if you have, say, samples of dozens of different clients, it can be very difficult to achieve that apples to apples comparison between yours and another. That's why for external benchmarking, you have these two different methods. You have the higher level in which you're accounting for differences and using those different details to identify points of improvement. And as well, when you have all the data available, the very, very specific breakdowns to try and see what you could possibly be achieving based upon what someone else is seeing. Next slide.
Thank you for all that helpful information, Matthew. And now here we have some helpful links for you all. We have our denial CARC and RARC category links. X12 is the source that most insurance companies use to enter the remark and CARC codes into their denials, so you can view them here. And as far as what Matthew discussed, benchmarking, we have the MGMA website and AAPC's E&M utilization benchmarking tool to help you on your road to benchmarking for your practice.
Thank you, Christina. And these are just some really helpful resources. We did get a couple of questions that asked about, will we have an opportunity to have these slides? You certainly will. And within these slides are, as you can see, some really great resources. We have an OPRCM overview document and also a couple of case studies and also a link to our pediatric RCM services from our website. So please take advantage of that for sure. And now we will get to some Q&A. Christina and Matthew, you are not quite done yet. We have some good questions. And let's see. So our first question from our audience is, how do you best approach a payer for a fee schedule reimbursement review?
I'll take that one, Matthew. The best thing to do is to know who your provider relations specialist is at your payer. So with every insurance that you signed a contract with, there's a good chance that you've been assigned a provider relations specialist to that region that you're in. They should be able to help you with contracting and who to go to as far as getting your fee schedules updated.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. This next question is a little vague, and so if we can't answer it, I'll let them maybe retype it in. But the question was, will I lose my tax ID if I sign up with you?
I don't believe so. No, it would just be a relationship shift, but your tax ID would remain the same.
Okay,
Matthew, do you have
great.
any insight?
Yeah, I mean, we're not providing the services. Christina's name nor mine appear on the claims as they're being sent to the payer, so your tax ID would probably stay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We just got another question in. Do you give specific coding advice or do coding training?
We do not.
Okay, thank you for that, Christina. We have another question that came in as, so the question is the data tracking tips are very helpful, but I would like to know if there is a quote unquote go-to place to view these metrics without having to pull reports.
That's a great question, actually. And OP users will be able to view and track these metrics and much more in our new financial analytics dashboard that we are currently working on. We expect it to break ground sometime in the fall. So we'll keep you updated on that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. Looks like we've got another good question here. What best practices do you recommend to expedite payments from insurance companies?
Well, first, we want to ensure demographics and coding information is accurate on the initial claim so that you're not having to resubmit them and deal with the rigmarole of a resubmitted claim and possibly having them manually review it and denying it for different reasons. And I think I would say enrolling in as many insurance companies' EFT ERA programs is available, because that's the fastest way you're going to get your money and the information that they have to share about the claims. So if you have any payers that you're currently with and receiving paper EOB or remittances or even money checks, try to look into that and get those signed up with as soon as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. Another question that we've gotten in is, how do I make sure insurance companies are paying our providers according to contractual rates?
Matthew, I'm going to take this one again if you don't mind.
Go for it. Go for
it. As I mentioned earlier, the best thing to do is to get in touch with your provider relations specialist. Most companies do have provider enrollment departments, but your provider relations specialist will know how to guide you in the right track. And if there is a contract that you have signed on file, go to the payer website. Some of them will actually have your contract there for you to view, but if not, request it from your provider relations specialist and they should be able to help you.
Lovely, Christina. And we are not done. We just got a slew of questions and the audience is really excited about this topic. So the next question is, if I am using a billing company, do I need to do RCM myself, or do I expect the billing company to take care of all analysis and management?
Well, in general, there should be a conversation and a dialogue, both around what metrics currently look like, as well as what expectations from both parties are. So if you're having your billing being done by some outside the organization team for you, then they probably have a sense of what they expect different performance benchmarks to be at overall, and potentially on like by payer level. And so it's important to have check-ins so that you can see that what those benchmarks that they're setting are, whether or not those are being achieved, and whether or not that's meeting your own standard for that information. Anything you want to add on that, Christina?
No, I agree.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Where are the analytic tools located in OP?
Well, I know for one, there are a lot of helpful reports that you can use to measure your performance on different levels in our clip and save SQL library. So you can go in there, you can find helpful reports that can pull things, say, like your paper visit or your coding levels, and run that in your own instance of OP to get that information and begin tracking that. I also know that in under billing, you have the ability to run transaction reports to be able to get some of those volume metrics as we previously talked about, and can split them between a bunch of different details. And you can do that right in OP. You can also export that to Excel. So in that transactions report, you can say, look at what you're posting per provider, per payer, and so forth.
Reimbursement analysis is also available in that same dashboard.
That's great to know. Thank you both. And the next question we have in is, how do we begin to extract the information to calculate these metrics? Is it through OP reports or is it through tools?
Yeah, so like we described, there's some information that already exists right within your billing software. We're working on adding more tools in those financial dashboards that's going to present that information nice and neatly without having to do a lot of the manual work that folks like myself do in order to get all of this data together. But if you really want to drill into, say, some of those like efficiency metrics, or even just want to capture data for KPIs that we might not have even covered today, I would highly recommend going to that clip and save SQL library, because those are going to be the most specific reports that you can get to, out of OP.
Additional information can also be found in our internal knowledge center for our OP clients as well.
Wonderful, thank you both. Our next question is, will the financial analytic dashboard be available to practices that do in-house billing?
I believe the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, I think everybody is supposed to have access to the dashboard.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you both. I think this is kind of a follow-up. You kind of spoke about this just now, Matthew. Any specific reports that could be run in OP? Are there any specific reports? And I think you touched on a few. Did you want to mention anything else about that?
So I would highly recommend starting with those volume metrics. You can pull that without running any fancy SQL reports in your OP, by starting with first the transaction analysis and recording your charges, payments, and adjustments by month. And then you can look at, there's a helpful AR report in there as well. In your OP software, you can run that and you can see what your accounts receivable looks like in total and the aging breakdowns. And that'll allow you to calculate, based on the formulas that are in our slide deck, your days in AR over 90, and your net collection rate. And you can begin tracking that over time to get minimum that highest level understanding of your operations performance. And you can even begin breaking that down by payer as well. All of that information can be split up by individual insurances, so you can track your performance on that more detail level as well. And then from there, I believe that there are what you can do from that point is you can run reports on, say, claim counts or visit counts based on reports and the SQL query library. You run that in the database viewer in your tools, and then you can reference that information against the volume metrics or the volume data that you've already collected to start working on grabbing stuff, say, like pay per visit. You can even you can look at as well, I believe in Clip and Save, is an adjustment reasons report, which will help you it will show you some of the remark codes that are being posted to your claims.
Great, thank you, Matthew. It looks like we have time for one final question before we wrap up here. And this question is, are NPs and PAs reimbursed at a different rate than MDs? The background on this is the NP or PA was the rendering provider with a supervising physician.
In my experience, yes. In my experience, depending on how you're billing it, NPs receive, I believe, 85% reimbursement of what the MDs are reimbursed. You may want to look into the specific payers that you're referring to, but I've seen that with several different types of payers.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think we are going to wrap up now. I think we're right about at time. I did see a few questions in there around cost, and everyone really is really excited about the financial dashboards. Absolutely reach out to your account executives and definitely fill out our survey when we close out this webinar to provide some of that feedback that you're looking for. I just wanted to remind everyone that you, of course, will definitely be getting a copy of the slide deck with those important resources available to you. And again, you do want to definitely put that information in the survey once we close out, because that's the only way to be qualified for the two $50 Amazon card giveaways. On behalf of Christina, Matthew, the entire OP team, I want to thank everyone for attending today. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I hope you all have a wonderful week ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, everybody.
It's been a pleasure. Take care.